Services Marketing, MKT 625.
Assalamu alaikum Khawateen wa Hazrat. This is Wasim Ahsan, your instructor for the course Services Marketing MKT 625 at the Virtual University of Pakistan. I welcome you to lecture number 43, which is going to be about pricing. We already have learned a couple of very interesting concepts about pricing, one being that pricing is quite difficult for services to work out as compared with that of manufactured goods. Sellers get into difficulties owing basically to the characteristics of services, and the areas which cause such problems were brought into focus while I was talking about the difficulty involved in working out prices for services in the previous lecture. The other difficulty is that it is not just the sellers who find such exercise a little challenging. The customers could also find it a little more difficult to understand why prices present themselves the way they do. Meaning why sellers of services could price their service products the way they price them. And there are quite a few factors that customers take into account. Apart from the monetary pricing which they pay toward the service, they also add to it with a certain costs involved with non-monetary factors. One being the time costs, search costs, inconvenience costs, and psychological costs. So in other words, customers tend to think it is not just the money which they pay to buy a particular service, they also pay it in terms of all those factors which are non-monetary in nature. But customers do have a way of putting a certain level of cost to all that. We have gone into the details of these non-monetary factors, and we are now going to take a look at the role of pricing in a little more detail. In the words of experts, pricing is both an attraction variable and also a repellent. Now, if we go by this statement, the immediate meaning which will flash into our mind is that both high price and low price can be an attraction variable, and at the same time, high price and low price can also repel customers. Why is it that this may happen in different situations is what we have to understand. And toward that understanding, what we need to know is the relationship between different levels of pricing with different levels of quality which service providers offer. Generally, a high price is associated with high quality. It is not always the case. It is the case when service cues or signals are very strong. What are these signals? Well, it is the communication which is done through advertising campaigns, meaning all the promises which sellers make with their customers. And if we revisit the concept of the managing promises, we know what I'm talking about. And if sellers are in a position to manage their communication campaign, which is realistic, then the chances are they will be trusted in the marketplace. So the signals are what is communicated through advertising campaigns and the guarantees and things like a reputation of the company which is selling a particular service, which may be the focal point of pricing. So when these signals are strong, customers do have a way of relating these signals with high quality because they know the reputation of the company and they know what the company talks about. It really comes up to it. It lives up to it. So therefore, they develop a relationship between a high price and a high level of quality. And in this particular situation, a high level of pricing is accepted. The people are inclined toward paying more money to buy a service which they trust in the marketplace. Conversely, if the signals are weak and the company is not really trusted in the marketplace, meaning it doesn't really have good reputation, and the communication campaign it carries out is not really a true reflection of what it delivers. Again, going back to the managing promises, we will know what the concept is all about. Then customers will have a tendency to accept a low price as something readily acceptable and not a high price, because the signals are non-existent or the signals are weak. When that is the situation, then customers will have a tendency to spend less money on a service with which the money losing risk is not all that great. Therefore, the relationship here is between a low price and a level of quality which is not really known, or for that matter which may not be very high. So we can say that customers do have a way of relating different levels of pricing with different levels of quality. And generally we can say the higher the price, the higher the quality is perceived by customers, and by the same token, the lower the price, the lower the quality of service is perceived by customers. Now, this is not to say that it is a very hard and fast rule. It certainly has exceptions to it, and a company which is new in a certain area, and it comes up with a new service at a high price without any communication support, the chances are service will not be accepted by customers because they do not really know much about the company, its background, the reputation, and so on and so forth. Even if they want to extract the word of mouth through their friends and relatives, they are at a loss to do so because the service is new and the company is new. And in this particular situation, the relationship between a high level of price and a service which may be a high quality service is not really applicable. And therefore, this certainly is an exception to the rule which I have talked. So we have seen the role played by pricing is extremely important because it really lets customers establish the level of quality of the service they are considering to buy. Another important role played by pricing is that of balancing the supply and demand situation. This is a concept that we have understood in detail, and we know the mechanism behind shifting demand from high peak demand period to low peak demand period. Not only we are in a position to charge the most optimal price during the peak demand period and enjoy the benefits of a decent level of profitability, we also are in a position as providers, of course, to stimulate demand during low peak period. And we really have understood very well the concepts of the differential pricing and yield management in this particular connection. I did talk about these two concepts in relation to the topic of communication, but since I already have talked about those, I don't really have to get into details all over again. Just to refresh your knowledge on these two concepts, differential pricing is the variation pricing in relation to different demand periods, and that is what I just tried to explain. The yield management builds on the methodology of differential pricing, and this is something which is very popular mostly among airlines. And they come up with a pricing model which carries different prices for different segments of their customers in relation to different time periods, meaning the time frame when the service is bought. The pricing is worked out with the help of sophisticated computer models that take into consideration the past purchase behavior of different segments of customers of the company, and thereby arriving at a model or a mix of pricing, the average of which is much better than if the company was just to establish one single price level. And that is the beauty of differential pricing and the yield management. So the two major roles played by pricing that we have understood are the ability on part of the customers to gauge the level of quality of a particular service, and the ability of the sellers to bring about a balance between supply and demand, two very important components of services marketing. We also have to take a look at what really determines the pricing. If pricing plays such an important role, then we must also know what really are the determinants. There are quite a few of those, and the ones which really should be taken into consideration are pricing objectives a company may have. The other one is the cost analysis which the company must carry out before it determines the pricing for a service it is selling. The third one is development of a demand price schedule, about which I shall be talking in detail in just a moment. And the next one is what is known to you from your basic course on economics and also the marketing management, and that is the price elasticity of demand. The next one is the level of competition and the kind of pricing which you have in order to respond to the competitive dynamics of the market. And yet another one is the operational position which the company may decide to take, the meaning of the few positions about which we are very well in the picture, i.e. the cost efficiency position, or customization or quality position in terms of technical features or functional dimensions, and so on and so forth. Now let's get back to all these determinants one by one in detail and try to understand how we as sellers can determine the pricing pattern. First of all, pricing objectives. These consist of 4 different areas, and we have these objectives in order to improve the marketability of our services. The first area about the profit maximization, whereas the second one could be about sales maximization. The third one could be about maximization of the market share, and whereas the fourth one could be about maintaining competitive parity. Now, as the terminology suggests, I think all these objectives are pretty much clear. Maximization of profits is something which we should get with the help of a pricing if we have that objective for the company. By the same token, the pricing should also yield the maximum level of revenues if we want to maximize our sales. The third one necessitates that we have a pricing pattern which allows us to go for maximization of the market share. And the fourth one is that we should be in a position to maintain competitive parity, meaning that we sell our service products at a price which is close to what the competition is doing, if not identical. Now, keep in mind that 2 objectives which relate maximization of sales, meaning revenues, and maximization of the market share are the ones which compromise profitability, because it is not really possible to go for maximum possible revenues and also increasing profitability of the company. If you are in a position to do that, if you happen to be in a monopolistic situation, it is something else, but generally it is not the case. And similarly, we have to accept certain profitability constraints when we are dealing with the other objective which necessitates or might necessitate maximization of market share. We get into maximizing market share when we have the objectives of driving competition out of the market, and when we think that the service that we are selling is extremely sensitive to a price level which has to be low so that we dominate the marketplace, and that certainly is a situation which compromises profitability. I'll talk about this concept a little more a little later. The next determinant of the pricing is cost analysis, and cost analysis basically is something that takes into consideration 2 major categories of costs, that is variable costs and fixed costs, and it also lets us look into the overall revenues and the gross margins which have to be adequate enough to cover variable costs and also ensure good returns toward fixed costs. Now, the reason I say good returns toward fixed costs because gross margins do not really have to be just about adequate to cover those fixed costs. If we have margins which equal the variable costs and fixed costs, then we are at a break-even situation. And you will know that from your basic course on accounting. And therefore, we have to have a margin which covers in the first place the variable costs, and then it more than covers the fixed costs, so that we are left with certain margins in order to enjoy a certain level of profitability which should be very much in line with the pricing objectives that I just talked about. So therefore, carrying out the cost analysis is extremely important in order to arrive at the final price. Regardless of what the pricing objective of a company is, each and every company must go toward improving its margins. That is something which goes without saying, because you improve the level of profitability, whatever objective you may have, by controlling your costs, by becoming more efficient, and not by increasing prices every now and then, because the marketplace may not accept those increases every now and then. And therefore, continual improvement of the operational process is a prime objective of every company. And the concept of process improvement or the process reengineering is all about improving processes, because by improving processes, you bring about cost efficiencies to the whole process. So therefore, the cost analysis has to be worked out by not just taking into consideration the cost categories as the fundamentals of accounting necessitate. We also have to take into consideration all those improvements which we may be able to bring about. As an example, banks keep getting into these kind of processes because they have to improve their cost efficiencies, and same is the case with other services organizations. The next determinant of pricing is demand price schedule, which really is an extension of the one that I've just talked about. And the basic idea here is to gauge the sensitivity of different levels of demand at different levels of pricing. In other words, if you happen to be a seller and you have to price a service, you are in a dilemma as to what should be the right price, whether it should be rupees 50 or 55 or rupees 60. Now, you just cannot go for what you may wish, you have to work out a detailed analysis, and that is an extension of the cost analysis which I just talked about. What you do is you work with different prices and see the sensitivity of demand at those various price levels, because not every price which differs from the other is going to have the same level of demand. It has to either increase or decrease. The lower the price, the more may be the demand, and the higher the price, the lower may be the demand. So this is kind of a relationship that we have to keep in mind, and while we work out these relationships, we also go back to the pricing objective that we have established to ourselves, whether it is maximization of profitability or maximization of sales revenues or market share, or it is just competitive parity because we happen to be in a situation of price war. So depending upon the pricing objective, we carry forward with this concept, and this can be explained with the help of the very simple graphical presentation that I have prepared for you people, and with the help of that we can really understand what I'm talking about. As you can see from this slide, on two sides of the slide, the meaning on the extreme left column and on the top row. Let us start with the top row, which talks about three schedules of pricing. Schedule 1 carries the unit price of rupees 60, whereas Schedule 2 represents rupees 55, and Schedule 3 is all about rupees 50. We have to pick one of these prices in order to establish the final one. Now, let us take a look at the extreme left column, which carries the major variables of a typical profit and loss account. We have first of all schedule, which I have talked about already. Then we have units. At the price of rupees 60, we are selling 130 units of our service, and at price 55 we are selling more because we have gone down in pricing. We are selling 146 here, whereas in schedule 3 we are selling 170 units of our service, generating a revenue of 7,800 as per schedule 1, and 8,030 as per schedule 2, and 8,500 in schedule 3. Now the interesting thing is the number of the units are increasing, and so do the revenue level, because we are increasing our units, therefore revenues have to increase. The next row is all about the variable cost, and keep in mind that the variable cost per unit is rupees 25, which is mentioned in the extreme left column. And at this the variable cost, we accrue 3,250 as per schedule 1, and then increase that to 3,650, and further increase that to 4,250. Now variable costs could have to go up because these happen to be variable and have to increase with the increasing demand, because we are producing and selling more units. The most interesting the row or the results that we have as per 3 schedules is the margins. As per schedule 1, we are making a margin of 4,550, and we go down on margin as per schedule 2, which is about, I think, 4% less than what we have in schedule 1, and it further reduces to 4,250 as per schedule 3, which is a decrease of close to 7% as compared with schedule 1. Despite the fact that we are selling more units, we are going down on our margins for the fact that we have reduced our pricing. We started with 60, went down to 55, and then 50. Now, the most interesting part of the whole thing is what should be the demand price schedule we should be picking in order to arrive at the final price. Again, it takes us back to the pricing objectives of the company. And if we have the objective of profit maximization, then obviously schedule 1 happens to be the most optimal schedule. And if the objective is to maximize sales revenues, then schedule 3 is the one that we should be working with, because we have the highest level of revenue of 8,500, although we have the lowest level of profitability. And this is what I meant by profit constraints. While we are working with this kind of a demand price schedule, we have to take into consideration very seriously the concept of price elasticity, and that is something that we have learned through a couple of other courses, and I therefore will not be getting into details of what price elasticity is all about. But in order to keep the whole thing very contextual, I have to talk about those fundamentals which affect the pricing patterns or the pricing strategies of the service sellers. And therefore, a couple of basics. We know that the price elasticity of demand is the change, the percentage change in demand as a ratio of the percentage change in pricing. What this really means is percentage change in demand divided by the percentage change in price. So in other words, when we change our price, there has to be change in demand as well. If we increase the price, the demand may go down, and when we decrease the price, the demand may go up. And the interesting thing about this concept is if the percentage change in demand is greater than the change in price, the demand is said to be elastic. If the change in demand is less than the change in price, then the demand is said to be inelastic. Now, we have to look at the managerial implications of this concept in the context of the pricing. If we take the case of the businesses would like to see their price elasticity of demand inelastic in certain cases and elastic in certain others. This is the interesting side that we have to understand. Let me give you an example. If a price increase of 5% on a particular service results in a drop in demand by 8%, then the demand is said to be elastic, because the percentage change in demand, which is 8%, is greater than the percentage change in price, which is 5%. So the demand is elastic. What is the implication for management? Well, before we try to understand the implication, what is the wish of the management? Well, the wish of the management would be not to see demand elastic in this particular case. In other words, if management of a company has increased the price, they would like to see the demand for their service product stick at the same point or at the same level, thereby making more profits and also revenue, which may not be the case in most of the situations, and which may be the case if you happen to be in a monopolistic situation or in a situation which is characterized by seasonality of a service, like if you happen to be a hotel at a resort in the northern areas selling the rooms at a price of your choice, because you are passing through the peak period and the customers will be willing to pay whatever price you may charge, and in that case the demand for your product may not be elastic and it still may remain inelastic. By the same token, meaning by the same concept, there would be situations in which the sellers would like to see their demand getting elastic, and I'm sure the mechanism must be flashing into your minds as to what I'm talking about. It obviously is about a price decrease. When businesses decrease their prices, they like to see a surge in the demand level of their services, meaning they like to see demand getting elastic. However, they have to be very careful about the decrease factor, which may not take the sellers to a point where they cannot generate enough margins which really can cover the variable costs and ensure a good return toward fixed costs. In other words, if gross margins are not adequate enough to cover these costs, then the increased the volumes and revenues and the market share are not really worth the effort. And that is something which has to be taken into account by sellers when they are carrying out the cost analysis, and along with that looking at the demand price schedules in the light of the price elasticity of demand, taking into consideration at the same time also the pricing objectives of the company. The next determinant of pricing is competition. Here, it doesn't really mean that we necessarily go for the pricing patterns followed by most of the players within the industry. Here, competition really means our sensitivity to price elasticity again. And what this concept necessitates is that we should not be at great variance in terms of our pricing from the pricing of competitors. In other words, if our price is much higher than that of competition, then the demand for our product is going to be elastic, meaning it will go down and we should lose. By the same token, if we are at great variance in terms of a low scale price, the demand again would be quite very elastic and it will give us larger volumes. But then we have to be very careful about the level of margins in relation to the costs that we need to cover. So this is what is really meant by the competition standing as one of the determinants of the pricing. And by the concept that I've talked about, it makes quite a lot of sense to stay close to the marketplace so that we are not really considered as the odd business out by our customers. We might be at great variance in terms of a higher price if we are offering a service which is extremely different from the rest of the crowd. And I will give you one example in relation to this kind of a pricing structure when I start talking about this particular concept. But generally, the prices are around each other in terms of their levels. The next determinant is the operational position which a company might decide to pick for itself. And the reason why a company picks one particular operational position is very well known to us. We have learned this concept in detail, and depending upon the service that we are selling and the industry that we are a part of, we decide to go for that particular operational position. Here, what is of importance is that if we have the cost efficiency position, we naturally would like to go for a price which is not very high, and it is very close to that of the competition, because the objective here is to maximize our sales and the market share. Everybody within the industry having this operational position, meaning cost efficiency, they would like to go for a competitive price and maximize the market share and revenues, because they have to industrialize the process. They have to do this thing over and over again, and there is so much repetition that the process has got to be highly industrialized. And the lifeline of that industrialization is achievement of the position of cost efficiency, which can only be achieved if you are working at a price which is sane, in line with this particular position. However, if a company has the position of customization, or for that matter quality, may that be technical features or may that be functional dimensions, the company has to charge a higher price. And in this particular situation, the prices which you are charging, they may not really have any relationship and relevance with what other players in the market are doing, because you have chosen a price on the basis of a certain logic and rationale, which I again will be talking in a few moments, because it takes more than things like just the cost analysis and the commercial side of establishing the pricing pattern. It takes into account a few qualitative things which are known as quality and value as perceived by customers, and that is something that I'll be talking about in a moment. But the question here is, once we have determined the pricing pattern for our services, we have to decide on the approach that we must bring into focus in order to implement that pricing pattern. And what are those approaches is going to be now the topic of the learning. Well, it becomes quite very obvious from the learning that we've had so far that there are three different, or there could be three different approaches toward pricing. The one is the cost-based approach toward pricing, the other one is the competition-based approach toward pricing, and these are the two approaches which are obvious from what I've talked so far. The third one is a little different from these two approaches, and that is what the experts call demand-based approach. And demand-based approach is the one which takes into account all those qualitative factors that I was referring to. And let me get to that point in an orderly fashion, and I'm going to tell you what that is all about. Let us focus our attention on what cost-based approach is. It is very obvious that it basically is a reflection of the cost analysis and demand price schedule which I talked about. And we take into account the price elasticity and so on and so forth. But the basic idea is to make sure that we have put together all the costs, meaning the two major categories of variable costs and fixed costs, plus a certain level of profitability in order to arrive at the final price. This is something which you have learned from basic accounting and also the marketing management, and therefore I don't really have to get into details, but the essence is that we add a certain portion of profits to those costs in order to come to the final pricing for our services. This approach is not as simple as it may sound because conceptually it is quite very straightforward, but when it comes to implementing this approach, it causes a lot of difficulties to service sellers. Service sellers, as I talked about earlier, certainly they get into the difficult situation while they try to trace and identify variable costs. So in other words, identifying variable costs in the area of services is a little more difficult than it is in the area of manufactured goods, for the simple reason that we take, in case of pure services and those which are very rich on credence, keep that in mind please, the variable costs are difficult to trace because sellers have to take into account the units of labor as those are put in by different level of professionals having different levels of expertise toward creating and delivering the service. Take the example of the health service setup. It is the contribution of so many different professionals who offer their services of different levels of expertise, and therefore it is quite very difficult to standardize those costs while sellers are creating heterogeneous services or a set of heterogeneous services. This is something which is to be underlined. The variable costs still could be standardized by applying certain mechanism, no question about that. But the question here is that in order to come up with a set of heterogeneous services which you don't know which segment of your customers is going to opt for depending upon their needs, you are at a loss to come up with pricing, and therefore it is difficult to trace and identify the variable costs which happen to be heterogeneous in nature as well. So it is the heterogeneous nature of these inputs as against the heterogeneous nature of services which are produced and delivered, and hence the difficulty involved in establishing the final pricing. This costing approach, which is cost-based pricing, is quite very popular among those industries which have to come up with pricing in advance. Now, this is something which is at variance with what I've been talking about earlier, and let me now specify which those industries could be. Example of such industries could be advertising, engineering, and construction, because these are the industries which really have to come up with estimates before business is awarded to them. And it is not very difficult for these industries to come up with the two major sets of the variable costs and fixed costs, because they always can put together costs relating materials and all the inputs by different levels of professionals. Now, this is the case for engineering and construction. Take the example of advertising as well. The agencies can know in absolute clarity all the rates put forward by different sections of the media. They know how much it costs to go onto the television, into the print media, and so on and so forth. So therefore, this approach is the one which is quite very popular among the industries that I have just cited. This cost-based pricing is also popular among consultancies and those the medical practitioners and legal practitioners who charge by a unit of the time they spend into the service. Meaning, if a doctor spends 15 minutes, he may like to make that as the basis of the input units of the labor he puts into the service. And then the incremental time a practitioner spends into delivering the service is a function of the basic unit which he has determined as the basis of pricing. Here, what is important is that professionals who go for cost-based pricing have to be sensitive to the complexities involved while they deliver different kinds of the services. Let us take the example of medical services all over again and think of two different services involving two different levels of complexity involved in delivering those. The one happens to be a little simple, whereas the other one is highly sophisticated, and both take 30 minutes each toward delivery. The pricing of the two services could have got to be different from each other. The one which is simple should carry a lower price, whereas the one which is more sophisticated should carry a higher price. In other words, here the basis of pricing should not be the units that have been put into as the time involved in delivering the service. Rather, it should be the expertise. This is something which the people have to take into account, and most of the practitioners could do that. The competition-based pricing, which I referred to earlier, is another approach which sellers might take. And according to this approach, the players within the industry like to stay close to each other. And as a matter of fact, this is an approach which works best in two given situations. The one is where the nature of service is highly standardized, like the basic courier service. It also could be basic dry cleaning service, and that is something which is delivered almost of the same quality by most of the players, and therefore they keep their prices very close to each other, meaning they are quite very competitive when it comes to pricing. However, they do not maintain great variance in terms of pricing. The other situation in which this approach might work, and it does work as a matter of fact, is an oligopoly, meaning existence of just a few large suppliers. Now, this is an approach which strategically makes use of the two different concepts. The one is the price signaling, whereas the other one is what they call going rate. These are the two policies which players within an industry follow. What happens is that one of the players, and in most of the cases the leading player, signals the one pricing, and it is matched by all others. Once it is matched, that becomes what they call the going rate. Now, the disadvantage this competition-based pricing carries is for small-sized sellers, because the small-sized sellers may not be in a position to sell their service at a price which is the going rate, because the going rate they may not afford the small seller the kind of margins the seller needs to cover all his costs, and yet arrive at a portion of the margin that offers him profitability. So small sellers feel kind of disadvantaged when they follow competition-based prices, and the piece of advice for them would be not to get into this kind of pricing. And that is why I said earlier, this is kind of a strategy which works in oligopolies, where you have just a few large suppliers, and the large suppliers are the ones with strong financial muscles, and therefore they can be competitive and afford to sell high volumes at the lower pricing, meaning they are in a position to work on smaller margins. The third approach to pricing is, which I referred to earlier, demand-based pricing. Demand-based pricing is quite very different from the two approaches that I've just talked about, for the simple reason that these two approaches, meaning cost-based approach and the competition-based approach, are very commercial approaches. Not to say that the demand-based approach is not commercial at all. All I'm saying is that the commercial angle is predominant, and we do not really take into consideration what customer really wants when it comes to making decisions, or the basis on which the customer makes decisions when he buys or does not buy a particular service. And therefore, demand-based approach is the one in which we take into consideration all those factors. Three important areas which are part of this approach are from those the difficult zones which I talked about in relation to difficulties which are presented to service sellers while they try to establish prices. And those are non-availability of references, because sellers do not really have the reference pricing. Demand-based pricing takes care of that. Demand-based pricing also takes care of the non-monetary costs in a beautiful way, and it also takes into account establishing the pricing on the basis of quality, or let's put it this way, judging quality on the basis of price. This is something which this model takes into the consideration, and we can say that this is a model which overall takes into the consideration the value of a particular service as perceived by customers. Now, the difficulty here is that we are dealing with different kinds of customers, and we have so many different segments of one, and therefore there is a need to customize our services, how to go ahead with establishing what really becomes the basis of the value as customer perceives when he decides to go for a particular service. This is the one challenge which the service sellers face, and this is an approach which really helps the service sellers to overcome that challenge, because they really have a way to go around the dynamics of the different segments and they come up with a pricing pattern that is most suitable for the value which the customers are looking for. Another challenge which the demand-based pricing offers the service sellers is the non-monetary costs. Like I said, it does take into account the non-monetary costs. How? Well, it all depends on the ability of the service sellers, how they can really convert the non-monetary costs into benefits. If the sellers are in a position to convert costs into benefits, then they are in a position to charge a little more. And before they charge a little more, they are in a position to convince the customers that they take care of all those costs which give them a lot of concern, meaning the time cost, the inconvenience cost, the search cost, and the psychological cost, fears, and so on and so forth. So in other words, while working out the value against all these non-monetary costs, sellers can do one thing. If they are in a position to overcome the time costs, inconvenience costs, search costs, and psychological fears, they also should be in a position to charge more. And customers should also be willing to pay more because they get value. And that is the essence of this pricing approach. Conversely, if the sellers are not in a position to save time costs, search costs, inconvenience costs, and psychological costs, they should compromise and make adjustments to the pricing pattern by charging prices which are on the lower side. Lower scale prices should reflect the inability of the sellers to overcome the non-monetary costs, or in other words, the constraints which present themselves while they try to come to grips with all those costs. Now, it is not that the customers are told by their sellers that the latter, meaning the sellers, are not in a position to overcome their costs. As a matter of fact, sellers have a few beautiful ways to go about the pricing pattern by creating different segments, and that is why they offer the different the strategies that we learned through the area of communication by offering the choices of the time and money, and by offering different levels of value relating to the different service products, and so on and so forth. So what is of importance is, and what really happens to be the greatest challenge in this pricing approach, is the ability of the service sellers to assign value to all those non-monetary costs. So in other words, the service sellers have got to be in a position to understand what is it that customers value. Is it time saving that they value, or is it inconvenience that they value, or is it the such cost or psychological fears? And then they've got to be in a position to overcome all those, and while they overcome all those, they can assign a certain weight to the translation of all those costs into benefits that they offer them while they establish their pricing. In simple words, all over again, I will say that the pricing they arrive at finally has taken into consideration the value factor, meaning all those factors which are valued by customers. Depending upon the extent to which customers value, service sellers can assign weightage to those factors in terms of their costs, meaning which become part of their pricing. In order to understand what really value is and what constitutes the value as perceived by customers, experts have categorized the customers into 4 different groups. And if we can develop understanding of these 4 groups, we shall be in a position to specify the demand-based pricing approach as it relates different customers under different situations having different kinds of values. The 4 categories are: number 1, experts say that there are customers who are price conscious and they think that the value comes to them by paying a low price or a lower price. The second category of the customers is the one who think they must get everything what they want in a service. The third category is that of those customers who think that the quality of the service they get corresponds to the price they pay. And the fourth category consists of all those customers who think they must get all the benefits against all that they pay. Now, there are the subtle differences while I make these 4 statements as initially stated by marketing experts. But when I talk about these in detail in the next lecture, everything will become clear as to how and why the different customers have different kinds of values and the level of value they attach to the different factors of non-monetary area, and how is it that service sellers should come up with a final pricing. For the paucity of time, I am constrained to further go ahead with the details of these 4 categories, and I would now like to give you a very quick recap of what I talked about during the lecture. Role of pricing is something that we have learned. A very important role played by pricing is that of letting customers establish the quality level of a particular service, and then we have learned the determinants of pricing, and while we go through the determinants of pricing, we also get a chance to establish the right kind of approach that we must take toward establishing the final price. We have learned 2 traditional approaches. The one is the cost-based pricing approach, whereas the other one is the competition-based pricing approach. The third one is the demand-based pricing approach, and I have just told you the essence of that approach, which is that customers first look at the total value as their perception in the first place and not the price. So therefore, before we establish the price, we have to understand what is it that constitutes that value. Once we understand that value, we can price the service. More on this in the next lecture. Thank you very much for your attendance, and I look forward to talking with you in the next lecture. Allah Hafiz.